And then I just relied on him letting me out.
All right, hi everybody, we're going to get started. There's quite a few people on the line and some of you have signed in groups, so I'm going to assume that everybody's present. My name is Eykelbosh. I'm a knowledge translation scientist from the National Collaborating Centre for Environmental Health in Vancouver. And today I'm going to be talking to you about cannabis risk messaging, so how we talk about pot matters. And this was developed in collaboration with my collaborator, Anne-Marie Nicole.
I'm here.
Also, yeah, there she's on the line. That's great. Thank you. So just before I flip to the next slide, I'm going to ask everybody who hasn't already done so to please put your phones on mute, just so we're not getting, there's more people on the line than I expected. So make sure that we're not getting any feedback from people in the room. Goodness. So, no, but it's not advancing. Click on screen. Oh, still not working. All right, technical difficulty. Oh, there we go. Okay. So, not that this group really needs an overview of this, but the current state of cannabis legalization is such that sometime perhaps this year, theoretically, the Cannabis Act is going to come into force, which will legalize the production, distribution, and possession of cannabis. So I like to always just start just thinking about what will actually be legal, because it kind of impacts some of the things that we're talking about today. So the public in theoretically July 2018, but probably later, will be able to publicly possess 30 grams of dried marijuana or its equivalent in other classes of cannabis. And if anybody has any questions about that, we can talk about that at the end. They can share up to 30 grams of cannabis with other adults. However, only the dried cannabis, cannabis oil, fresh cannabis, cannabis plants, and seeds can be sold. So this is important because it affects what's actually going to be legal. Is there audio online?
No.
No. No. Yeah, so we will just be communicating via chat at the end, do you think?
Yeah, only chat window, and there's no phone line.
Yeah, there's no phone line. Okay.
Phone into the phone line?
The phone works on the telephone, just not on the computer.
Yeah, and the reason for that is just not to have a lot of background noise. So we can try to do questions at the end by chat, and that should work out, although there is more people on the line than I expected. So in terms of what will actually be legal when legalization finally occurs, as I said, cannabis oils will be, edibles will not be. That's going to be later. But then there's the question of some of these concentrates. And so bubble hash is a concentrate that's made out of ice water extraction of the resin, and it can be made at home. So there's going to be some things you can make at home and some things that you can make at home. Basically, the things you can't make at home will be all the things that are made with an organic solvent. So anything that's flammable, so butane or isopropyl alcohol, propane, all these things can be used to make hash oil. And the reason why I'm talking about this is it really comes into some of the environmental health messaging we're going to be talking about later on. You can also make non-organic extracts from cannabis. via non-solvent-oriented methods, so supercritical CO2 extraction. And these will not be legal because concentrates will not be legal and to be produced commercially. And the reason why is that only commercial enterprises are really going to be using supercritical CO2 because it's very expensive. So the rest of these things on here are actually going to be legal. Mostly you can make them at home or you can buy them. So you can make rosin or wax at home. You can buy tinctures and sprays, topicals, and I think vaping solution is not going to be legal right away, although there's some confusion on that. So really the risk messaging challenges is what I'm going to be focusing on today. And so we're going to be kind of talking through this using basic risk communication principles, but also I'm going to be orienting this towards some of the environmental health risk messages. So at the end of the presentation, we'll talk about some of the general public health risk messages that are out there, and then the environmental health risk messages that the National Collaborative Center for Environmental Health is working on. So the key challenges here are how we can craft health communications that are adequately and fairly informing the user of the risks to themselves and others, that reduce the harms to those who choose to use, and finally, and most importantly, are not relying on any kind of stereotype, fear, or stigma to control people's behavior. The three kind of risk communication basics that I keep in mind here are, the first one from crisis communication, be first, be right, be credible. In the case of cannabis, we are definitely not first. There is very powerful normalization cannabis usage messages out there already, which are going to be very difficult to overcome, particularly among youth. So that makes being right and being credible all the more important. The next important thing is to use simple, plain, appropriate language. We'll be talking a little bit about terminology and, of course, target audiences. We'll be talking about that kind of at the end. So there's kind of quite a few different things that I want to hit on. The first one is about terminology. The next is about understanding the limits of evidence, which I think is a place where a lot of public health people run into problems. Neither relying on stigmatization nor normalization. We'll talk about why that is. Limiting or reducing the harm for new and established users, ensuring that everybody understands their responsibilities with respect to cannabis. And that's not just your rights, but also your responsibilities. And finally, this is kind of the key thing that NCCEH is working on, is ensuring that home growers, personal cultivators, which will be allowed, I guess, in, may be allowed in everywhere. I think Manitoba and Quebec have allowed or may allow personal cultivation, to make sure people know how to safely grow, process, store, and dispose of their cannabis. So the terminology thing, this is where I'll just jump in, is really interesting. Back in October, there was a newspaper article that came out. It was about whether or not we should be using the term marijuana, whether or not the term marijuana is actually inherently racist. And I thought this was really interesting, and I actually really applaud that person for bringing it up, because we want to have this kind of lens in everything we do in public health. But in the case of whether or not marijuana is racist, it's a little complicated. And so I actually don't oppose the use of the term marijuana. It's kind of generally used in the American public health conversation. But if we want to understand why it could be perceived as a negative term, it's because back in the day, smoking of cannabis was something that was actually introduced to the USA by immigrants from Mexico and South America around the end of the last century. Before that, people in America were using cannabis all the time. They were using it as tinctures and teas, and it was part of kind of a, almost like an over-the-counter medication, like a Tylenol kind of thing. And so it really, and it was very low potency, but it wasn't unheard of, and everybody knew it as cannabis. So smoking only came a little bit later with these immigrants. So at about the 1930s, when some people say that the reason why cannabis prohibition happened is because the prohibition of alcohol ended in the 1920s. And as a result of that, the people who needed a new job decided to focus on prohibition of cannabis. So in any case, whatever the reason was, around the 1930s, there was this extremely aggressive U.S. government campaign to stigmatize cannabis by basically banning fear of Mexican immigrants and people of color. So one of the key tactics in that campaign was actually to deliberately shift the language from using cannabis, which was actually a word everybody knew, to marijuana, which was this really unusual foreign or dangerous sounding thing. And so they paired this language shift with kind of almost like a traveling roadshow of stories about Mexican immigrants, people of color, and also innocent white citizens under the influence of cannabis engaging in all sorts of like crime and criminal insanity, usually with some really ugly kind of like sexual violence aspect to it. And so it really, as a result of that, marijuana, like the word marijuana, became this kind of tool of prohibition. But in fact, marijuana is a very common term in all other parts of Latin America. So you'll find in Latin American literature and conversation that cannabis is almost never used and marijuana is. So it's not the word itself that's the problem, it's how it was used. And, you know, whether, I don't think anybody thinks about it that way now, but it still is a great way to just remind ourselves that, you know, in the past, this happened and it's important to be sensitive to it. So in terms of the terminology, there's many different words. I'm also Spanish speaking and my family is Mexican, so I also know all the Mexican words for pot. And there's many, many, many terms for pot. So the word pot itself comes from Spanish actually, and it's short for a drink that was previously imbibed. It was wine and brandy with a cannabis infusion in it called potación de guaya, which is the drink of grief. Weed is referring to the butter, the flower. Ganja is actually an Indian or Sanskrit term from like a sacred text, also referring to the flower. And grass is related to the hippies, the flower power movement. Hindu texts also refer to cannabis as sacred grass. So there's many, many, many different terms. It seems like we have a wealth of interesting words to use in our public education and awareness campaigns, but I would argue against that. So basically our kind of that using the formal terms emphasizes the regulatory aspect rather than a user-based or promotional aspect. And if you look to the literature about drugs, you will drug communication, public health risk communication, you'll see that being cool tends to fall flat with youth. And I think that we actually have somebody from Health Canada online today. They recently did a focus group, I think, with Boys and Girls Club, and I was really interested. They got almost that exact same feedback back from these youth, which was that trying to sound cool and like by using these slang terms is just not going to be a useful approach. So the other reason why we want to stick to the formal terms is that some of those informal terms that are out there to discuss cannabis really undermine the goals of public health, period. So, you know, the slang terms rather than the formal term, smoking versus using, just recognizing there's many ways to use cannabis, not just smoking. Recreational is obviously something that all of us would like to see go away because it, like when we promote cannabis as recreation, it really serves to normalize the practice. So shifting from recreational to something like non-medical or adult use or commercial would be, I think, a better tactic. Driving high sounds like fun, whereas driving impaired sounds like jail. And so you're kind of drawing on that terminology from like alcohol, where we're saying you're using the same thing to say this is the consequences. The consequences for driving impaired with cannabis will be the same as if you're driving impaired with alcohol. And then finally, the word dispensary is something I think everybody would like to see go away as well. Dispensaries, it has this very kind of like medical beneficial slant to it, which is, in some cases it's okay because, I mean, it's not deliberately malicious because some of the dispensaries are legitimately, they're compassion clubs, they're trying to provide access to cannabis as a way for people to access medicine. However, from the public's perspective, the public may confuse dispensary medical grade cannabis with actual medical cannabis that comes from regulated facilities. And so they may not be aware that the medical grade, quote unquote, cannabis that they're buying from a dispensary is actually coming from who knows where. It could be coming from happy hippies living in an idyllic valley, growing organically, or it could be coming from organized crime, spraying it with pesticides. So the word dispensary is very misleading to the public because it means different things for different people. So just plain out calling them retail outlets or commercial or for-profit enterprises would be much more honest. So the basic kind of message that we try to stick to is that the promotion and advertising of cannabis is going to be strictly regulated, And there's a reason for that, which we'll talk about next, and just to not do the work of industry for them by using these terms like recreational, especially, and dispensary.
Okay.
So the limits of the evidence. This is a really important point. I was recently in a focus group here in Vancouver, and it was a bunch of different doctors and other public health people, as well as people from education and law enforcement. It was really actually a very nice mix of people. And then some lay people were also in the conversation. And I found this situation very interesting because we had all these professionals sitting around a table talking about how cannabis would impact their profession and their practice. What were the tools they thought were lacking? What were the things they were concerned about? And then at the end of all this very detailed, thoughtful, I thought very balanced, very carefully thought out conversation, the lay people were like, yeah, but this is all a bunch of reefer hysteria, isn't it? Actually just worried for nothing. And so it really blew my mind because these people had actually listened to almost an hour of very legitimate concerns and then dismissed it as reefer hysteria. So this is a real credibility issue for public health. We are still perceived as being overly biased against cannabis. And I think part of that problem comes from when we inappropriately use evidence. And so this does happen, and it's partly because our knowledge of cannabis risks is just really incomplete. And the reason behind that is that it's been illegal until this point. So legalization is actually going to greatly facilitate our ability to research and understand cannabis, and will, hopefully give us the facts and the science and the evidence to talk about cannabis in less uncertain terms. But until then, until that point, it's really important because of this credibility issue to stick what we clearly know, not go out on any limbs, for example. So simply some really simple things, inhaling particulates and PAHs is bad, regardless of what you're smoking. Smoking is bad, period. Careless use and storage can lead to child and pet poisoning. Driving impaired is dangerous. All of these things are things that are obvious things. We don't need to get into debates about whether or not, cannabis facilitates or is merely correlated with psychotic breaks. We don't, these things are not resolved, to my satisfaction at least. So until then, sticking to these much more simple messages, which are still very powerful, I think is a much smarter tactic. So we need to present health effects info. There's this document came out in January of last year. It's from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And it's the most comprehensive to date review of the health effects of cannabis and cannabinoids. So it takes the strength of evidence approach, which means it looks at all the studies. It weeds out the studies that don't meet their criteria for quality, and then it rates all the evidence based on whether the evidence related to a specific condition is insufficient, limited, moderate, substantial, or conclusive. So it's actually pretty useful if you're not up to date on all the cannabis literature, which I don't feel anybody could be because there's just a ton of it. So this is actually very useful as an orientation for pretty much anybody in public health. It allows us to present that information in context and prevent this reefer hysteria label being put upon us. So one of the things that came out of the report from the chief medical health officers and the UPHN in 2016 was this idea of neither stigmatizing nor normalizing cannabis use. And the reason why that is, if nobody's ever seen this figure before, is that when you have pure prohibition or pure commercialization, so complete prohibition or complete freedom, you actually have the same degree of social ills. And so complete prohibition is associated with social ills like people being, as we all know, becoming incarcerated because they are being busted for pot when they're 15 years old and affects the rest of their lives. It also prevents people who need help from getting help. It prevents us from developing treatments for people who do need help. And then on the other end, on the legalization end, commercialization is commercialization is basically when you give the commercial world free rein to do what they do best, which is to get as much pot as possible into people's hands as cheaply as possible. And so obviously when you have that situation, you're going to have more users than you ever have had before, because they will be promoting it as part of a healthy lifestyle. And then a greater fraction of the population will potentially have problems. So the sweet spot is somewhere around here, which is what we're trying to hit. But I think that in some parts of the media, especially when I read it, this losing focus on that public health approach and really pushing more towards just a pure commercialization approach. There's a lot of just excitement about how much money this is going to make. So remembering that pure commercialization is something that will negatively impact our population is, I think, very important. So this is something that I don't think we need to really talk about here, but basically you're trying to just limit harms for people, whether they're new or established. So for the new users, that's the public education campaigns about diversity and potencies of products, including edibles when they finally become illegal. And somebody here in BC actually made a really great point, was how can we make low potency products available? Like, is there any way that we can require producers to have something that's less than 10% THC? Maybe say it's 5%, something real, or 5%, 5 milligrams. Something that's really low end. If people are very naive and they want to try it, then they can try something that's very low. Maybe they'll stay at the low dosage. So that's actually a pretty good idea. For the established users, it's trying to improve habits. So one of the things that I was quite surprised with some literature that we reviewed is how much of contaminants actually pass through the smoke when cannabis is inhaled. So it's something like 60%. If you have a cannabis joint that's laden with pesticides and that's smoked, the pesticides are not combusted when they pass through the cone of the cigarette. So they are actually about 60% of them pass directly to the lungs. So there's the general ills of smoking, and then there's also these kind of issues with contaminants that are in pot. So maybe if we encourage people to use filters, that might be a way that we can reduce some of those harms. But what most people in public health are focused on, and I get asked about constantly, is about the evidence for suggesting people use other forms, so edibles or concentrates. And that is something that requires a lot more discussion. We don't know enough about concentrates in particular, and where edibles are concerned, our Poison Control Center data indicates that edibles are, they may seem, they're a lower barrier for the user to use, so they don't smell bad, they taste good, they are, a much more social experience than perhaps smoking, because some people just don't like smoking. Yeah. But when we look at our Poison Control Center data, edibles are associated with many, many, many more negative events, just because people tend to over-imbibe. So it's really difficult at this point to say whether or not it's appropriate for public health to be recommending that we use other forms. So for all users, what we here at the BC CDC and the National Collaborating Center for Environmental Health would like to see is having better access to information for treatment in case of problems. So here at the BC CDC, we have the Drug and Poison Information Center, and I'm just going to kind of go through all this. So I kind of jumped to the second one here. For those of you who don't know, and I'm sure most of you do, the Poison Control Centers are anonymous, and they are staffed by highly trained professionals who have thousands of hours of training in basically the treatment of all different kinds of intoxication, including cannabis. So here in BC, we actually get quite a few calls about cannabis. Don't quote me because I'm not directly on this project, but in the last 5 years, I believe we've logged about 900 calls on cannabis. And there's actually a team at BC CDC right now going through this data, and they're trying to understand, they're trying to answer a bunch of different questions. But the biggest question is, how can we use Poison Control Center data to better track the effects of cannabis in the population? So one of the things that we'd like to see for sure is promotion of the use of the Poison Control Centers for accidental poisonings in general or other adverse events like cannabis. So putting the local Poison Control Center number on every label of every cannabis product would be amazing. If you eat too much of that commercial brownie, whatever it is, then you have the number there right in front of you. You can call somebody to get help, because most people don't know this, but the effects of cannabis intoxication can be very mild. They can be things like a bit of shakiness and a bit of paranoia. They can be really horrible. They can be cyclical vomiting. They can be very unpleasant for adults, and in children, they can range at everything from, you know, a bit of tachycardia, a bit of hypoventilation, to seizure to coma. So it's not just private individuals who call the Poisons Control Center. It's also ER docs and physicians often call our DPIC because they have encountered what they think is cannabis intoxication, but they're not quite sure what to do. So using these poison control centers for the amazing resource they are is something that I would highly, highly recommend. So the other thing that we here at NCCEH have focused on is advice on growing, using, and storing products in the home. So we're recognizing that we have many means and ways to control commercial sources of cannabis, but once people have the ability to cultivate, and as I said, cannabis, or Quebec and Manitoba, I think at this point have said no personal cultivation, which may be wise, but when people are allowed to grow their own stuff at home, they may not have good advice on how to do so. So they may adopt some risky practices from illegal cultivation. So those are things like using CO generators or CO2 generators that create carbon monoxide in the home. They might be using illegal pesticides or other. You might also have children and pets, but also other adults accidentally poisoning themselves, which is where the poison control centers come in. The other challenge that we have is finding treatment and tools for cannabis use disorders. Some of the clinical people that I work with are really concerned about this because they don't feel that they have adequate tools. I don't know enough about that to comment, but it's something where potentially use of the poison control center data and discussion around these adverse effects that we see with cannabis may help us get to a point where we can start establishing research for these things. This is the document that I'm sure everybody on the line has seen. It's Canada's Lower Risk Cannabis Use Guidelines. This is, you know, from CMH and others. It's recommendations to incorporate into messaging that will hopefully result in fewer adverse effects. NCCEH has a cannabis page of resources. It's a topic page, we call it, for environmental health practitioners, and it contains this document and many, many other documents about cannabis and environmental health. So in terms of the legal responsibilities, this is really just referring to the kind of penalties that have changed. So the two objectives of legalization are to avoid criminalizing cannabis users, including youth, and of course cutting off the black market. But also we need to be reminding people that it's not the Wild West either. The public needs to be educated regarding their new responsibilities and new offenses. And this is going to be very challenging because in the case of personal cultivation, we have limits on plants, and we have, you know, 4 plants per household, and you can't get together with other people to have, you know, 8 plants if you have 2 adults. There are very, people have thought out about how much cannabis should be allowed in the home. However, law enforcement has repeatedly said, and you can find various briefs and documents from law enforcement about this, that personal cultivation is going to be almost impossible to police, almost impossible to enforce. And so as a result of that, potentially some people are going to be growing a lot of cannabis in their homes. And they may be doing other things, which I'll talk about shortly, such as hash oil production. So hash oil production is really a very, very dangerous activity. Just last week in Mirabel, Quebec, there was a house that exploded. It killed 1 person, seriously burned 2 people, and a 4th person, I think, escaped. But that's a suspected hash oil explosion. And, you know, understanding, people need to understand what their responsibilities are vis-a-vis things like that, because, for example, in Canada, the maximum penalty for something like chemically altering cannabis using an organic solvent is 14 years in jail. So you would really want people to understand that before they attempt to make their own at home. So we have a number of examples in here on risk messaging campaigns. So Colorado's Good to Know program is actually a really great example. It's my favorite. It's not Anne-Marie's favorite, but it's mine. So I like it because it goes over the laws and penalties and really helps people understand where they can use cannabis without getting into trouble. So something as simple as not taking your cannabis to the ski hill, which is actually federal land in the US, is not considered state land. That can result in, you know, a felony. Safe use is on there, tips for tourists, health effects, and use prevention. It's really quite nicely done. It's really easy to understand, and it's a great slogan. I just love the slogan. It's good to know. You can do whatever you want with this information, but it's just good to know. Oregon has their own. This one, I believe, was from Washington. They also did they used a 2016 health youth use survey, which I found really interesting to understand how young people think about cannabis. It's available online. This is Anne-Marie's favorite, educate before you recreate. I guess it's a little risque, right, Anne-Marie?
It is. I do like this one because it's not cool, but it's still hip. So that's part of why I think it's a good program.
Yeah, it was nicely done. So the last thing I want to talk about is again coming back to personal cultivation, and so making sure that home growers understand how to safely grow, process, store, and dispose of their cannabis. And so, as I mentioned, many of these home growers are going to be first timers. They're not going to have good advice. They may use those risky practices, and they may not stick to 4 plants. That's a concern because growing at home, personal cultivation entails a number of risks. And so those are things like inappropriately using inappropriate use of pesticides, issues with cannabis adding to humidity in a home, and humidity adding to mold and odor issues. So there's kind of an indoor air quality. In addition to all the secondhand smoke, which could happen, there's also these kind of other indoor air quality issues. Safely disposing of moldy plants is a big issue, or it has been an issue in Colorado and Washington. There's quite a solid waste disposal issue with cannabis, like cannabis plant material, as well as safely installing equipment and using solvents to make concentrates. So I got and repeated that right there. So the thing that I have talked about previously are these hash oil explosions. And then there's other things like the use of things that I didn't even think about before starting this project, things like the use of UVC. So you could actually use UV to manipulate your cannabis plants when they're grown at home. If you use a lot of UVA or UVB light, you can actually increase the growth and increase the budding. And by using UVC light, you can actually kill pathogens without using pesticides. So some people will actually buy a UV bulb and they'll pop out the filter so that it starts emitting UVC, which of course we know is very high energy UV light. And that can be potentially very damaging to the skin and eyes. And so if you're not aware of this, this hazard, you may have people coming in with that kind of blackened keratitis from UV or damage to the eyes, or children wandering into a grow room not knowing the UV lights are on. These are issues. CO2 generators are another thing. CO2 generators are, you can generate CO2 to try to increase the yield of your plants. By pumping them full of CO2, you're actually pushing forward their photosynthetic process, and they grow bigger, taller, they're bigger flowers, which is what, of course, everybody wants. And then as a result of that, or in order to do that, they can actually use natural gas or propane-powered ignition devices. So it's a compressed gas tank hooked up to a burner inside a home. And it seems crazy, but people do this. This is actually, they're widely available through online retailers. You can even buy these things on Amazon, Amazon.ca. You can buy these things. And so they basically they're producing CO2, but at the same time they're producing carbon monoxide. And this could be pretty hazardous. Obviously, we've had, unfortunately, quite a few carbon monoxide deaths across Canada that were very highly publicized recently. So I don't want to present CO2 generators as something that's like an imminent, huge, super dangerous risk, because it's not. I've spoken to a number of fire officials and fire investigators, and they do see these devices, but there's not many instances in which these have actually killed people at the level that they're used now. Okay. That said, you don't want to encourage people to be having these in their houses either. So probably the bigger issue is those hash oil explosions. So I'm collecting data for a paper that I'm writing right now about hash oil explosions as one of the environmental health risks. And to put it in context, there's been about 30 of these explosions in Ontario in the last 5 years, and about 36 in BC in the last 20 years. And I thought it was very strange that there were fewer in BC, but it might be because people in BC, we don't have the cold winters, and so people will actually try to do more of their hash oil processing outside where there's less likely to be an explosion, and In fact, I was talking to a fire marshal from Ontario who was super helpful. He actually told me that in Ontario, there's actually seasonality to these butane hash oil explosions. So they see more in the fall and the winter. When people start getting cold and they move the process inside, they do it in their basement and then, blow the house up. So these are kind of the general issues that we're worried about. And so what are we doing? Well, we have a webinar that's just on these EH risks on January 10th. Unfortunately, that's completely maxed out. That we've done that twice now, and it keeps getting oversubscribed. We also have a topic page on resources for practitioners that I mentioned, and we're writing a paper for growing at home, health and safety concerns for personal cultivation, and that's involving input from inspectors, from policymakers, from fire people. I think it's going to be really useful. And then finally in February, we're going to be focusing on cannabis. We're going to be having all of these different resources laid out. And unfortunately, I won't be there at that point because I'm actually going on maternity leave at the end of this month. But other NCCEH staff members will be kind of taking it, and of course, Anne-Marie will be taking up the work going forward. So I just want to end with this. The major challenge that I see coming out of all of this kind of risk communication discussion is that there's just so many messages. So here on this screen, this is like a very simplified depiction of all the different things that I think about. So today I've kind of talked to you about the things in purple. So things like pest control and pesticides are a big issue. We don't have good legal, we have pesticides that are approved for commercial use, but we don't have good oversight of pesticides for home use, for use on cannabis, and specific instructions on how to use them. So I feel, or we feel, that pest control may be an issue, as it has been in Washington and Colorado. Indoor air quality and fire stuff. But then there's all the other things that public health has been talking about, and there's the kind of like higher level things. So things like impaired driving and mental health, cognitive development, pregnancy and breastfeeding. You may or may not be aware, but there's quite a few people out there who now believe that cannabis is an excellent treatment for morning sickness. Yeah. As well as addiction. So you can be addicted to cannabis, but very few people know that. So there's so many of these messages, and it's going to be very, very challenging for us to present them in a way that is not overwhelming and also gives a good idea of the relative risk of these things. So one way to frame it is looking at immediate risks versus those developing over time. So some of these issues may develop over the longer term. If they become a problem, they'll become a problem over time. It will take us even more time to collect data and understand what's happening on them. So things like changes in, who's becoming addicted and what their outcomes are. Things like pregnancy and breastfeeding, like what are the effects of cannabis on neonates, things like that. Those are kind of longer term things that won't become available or become obvious over time. Other things, however, are things that are very specific and immediate, things that will happen during the transition period. So immediate risks, for example, due to inappropriate pesticide use and hash oil, those are things that can happen right away. And that's actually what happened in Colorado, Washington, and California, especially with the pesticides. That they began legalization and then later on down the road realized that there was such an issue with all of these very inappropriate pesticides showing up on commercial cannabis products. So they had, in Colorado in particular, many recalls related to cannabis and hundreds of thousands of dollars of product going into the trash because people were using myclobutanil or any of these other like just very inappropriate pesticides. And as a result of that, Colorado later had to come up, and Washington and now California as well, come up with their own criteria for selecting and testing for specific pesticides. To detect them, and then also having a list of recommended pesticides or permitted pesticides, although they're not, technically the regulators, they're not the EPA, so they can't really like mandate they use a particular pesticide, but they had to kind of learn as they went because pesticides turned out to be such an issue. As well as hash oil explosions were a bigger issue in Colorado and California because there was a lot of plant material around and people just decided that they would make hash oil with it. So you may, got somebody on the line. I could talk all day about hash oil and about why people make it. There's actually a really interesting story behind it, but we don't really have time for that. So just to summarize, cannabis is going to be legal next year, or this year, I guess. I need to change this slide. So getting that messaging right requires basic risk communication principles, which all of us are familiar with, but apply to cannabis. Choosing that terminology carefully, presenting the health risks credibly and with context. So trying to aim for somewhere between reefer madness and dazed and confused, which is where I learned about cannabis when I was a teenager. Dazed and confused, not good lessons. But yeah, we want to be hitting somewhere in the middle of that, and try to promote lower risk use, and finally trying to be comprehensive and strategic about how these various different messages are presented. So obviously I feel that the environmental health messages are very important, but they need to fit in with this overall broader strategy. So what you guys can do right now, if you wish to, is first of all, converse with us here at NCCEH. We are writing this Growing at Home, this personal cultivation paper, and we have kind of the draft that we have. Basically what it does is it lays out all of these risks. It lays out some of the policy or regulatory options that provincial governments can use to try to abate some of those risks. And then it also includes public health risk messaging suggestions for each of the things that I've kind of brushed on here today. So that paper is going to be even more useful if more people input to it. So if you're particularly interested in this topic, give me a shout out. I just realized I did not put my email address on this, but it is available through I think on the Eventbrite. And Health Canada is also doing their consultation on the proposed regulations for cannabis legalization. So that can be an online questionnaire or written submission, and that has to be in by January 20th. So that's actually a really great, the consultation document is quite long, but it's actually a really great opportunity to look at where Health Canada is going and how those proposed regulations might affect provincial policies. So at that point, I'll jump to the, Tina, you want to help me? Is it this one here?
Yeah.
Which one?
Yeah, just that one.
So we can actually, yeah, my email address is here as well as Anne-Marie's. So certainly after January 26th, I will not be answering emails. If we have any questions, please just put them into the chat box. Or
Sharing the
slides afterwards. So the slides are actually already available online. They're an older version than this one. I could share this if this was, I could also share these ones, I think.
Angela, I think you should just, if you don't mind, explain why the hash oil phenomena has occurred and why having more cannabis flower around might increase this as an issue.
Okay, sure. So hash oil, for those of you who don't know, hash oil is interesting to cannabis users because for two reasons. First of all, it's incredibly potent. It's anywhere between 60 and 90% THC, so it's a very much more immediate high. But what a lot of people don't realize is that it's also a very different high. It's a very different experience than other forms of cannabis. So people who are looking for hash oil, they're not just looking for like a really, really, really heavy high. They're also looking for this other kind of completely different way to use cannabis. And it's also a very organoleptic experience because it's a lot about the hash oil. When it's produced, it has a very particular flavor and smell to it. And so there's kind of like a connoisseurship that has developed around hash oil. The other reason why hash oil is so popular and such interest to cannabis users is that it can be made from the flower. The best hash oil comes from the flower, but it can actually be made from the waste parts of the plant too. So all the leaves or the trim, the shake, they might call it, which have been trimmed off from the buds, those can also be processed to make hash oil. So we have a situation where somebody grows their 4 plants for, however many, I think it's like 8 to 12 weeks or something. And then they clip all the flowers and they've got them dry and they're like, okay, that's cool. I've got this many grams of cannabis flower, but now what do I do with all this plant material that's laying on my floor? And can I benefit from that in some way? And so what some people will try to do is to make hash oil. And it's really difficult when you have, like, personal cultivation is kind of an issue because it puts so much more of the raw plant material into people's hands, and then people just, wonder how they can make use of it and not waste it. In California and Colorado, both of those places allowed personal cultivation for medical reasons, and then later on, they've now both shifted to recreational cultivation as well. And both places have had pretty serious hash oil explosion problems. So in Colorado, there's been quite a few, but they also had a lot of plants available. They had the personal cultivation limit was 99 plants per person, and it's only recently been decreased to 12. And same as in California, the number of personal plants was quite high, and as a result, people just had a lot of the plant material around. Concentrates were also legal at the time, but it seems that when people have a lot of access to the plant material, that's kind of a fundamental problem. On the other hand, in a place like Washington had personal medical growth, but when they went to recreational, quote unquote, when they went to personal cultivation for non-medical means, they actually didn't. They actually did not ever allow personal cultivation outside of medical means. They also allowed concentrates to be sold legally right from the very beginning. So as a result of that, people didn't have access to a bunch of plant material, and they did have legal access to concentrates. And as a result, almost no hash oil explosions. So I think that's actually a really important thing to take away, is that, you know, we're all very afraid of concentrates because they're extremely high potency, and we really truly don't understand what the effects of regular use of those products will be on the brain. But at the same time, allowing people to cultivate personally and have the plant, but not allowing them to access legal concentrate may result in a hash oil explosion issue. So,
Thank you.
From Peterborough, no problem. From Peterborough, does NCCEH have a sense of how many people are expected to grow their own cannabis? That's a great question. All of this depends on the extent of legalization and whether or not people choose, completely in the absence of any regulatory regime, they choose to stick to the 4-plant limit. So some of the environmental health issues are very, very scalable with the plant limit. So for example, humidity control. The more plants you have in your house, the more of a humidity issue you're going to have. A full-grown cannabis plant is equivalent to 5 to 7 tropical plants. So they actually put a lot of water into the air. And so if people choose to stick to the 4 plants, maybe they'll be fine. But if they decide to, you know, grow 15, they might have a problem. So it depends on that. It also depends on just how easy it is to buy. You know, how much growing cannabis is not difficult per se. There's some mold issues that can be a little bit challenging to deal with. So I expect that in the short term, many people are going to try it, and then they're going to get bored or tired or frustrated, and they're just going to go to buying it. And that would probably be the best for everybody.
Is it possible for a city to enact a bylaw to prohibit personal growth?
So someone here in the room has asked whether or not a city can prohibit personal growth, and there's 2 answers to that. First of all, provinces can and have been limiting personal growth. Like the federal legislation says you can grow up to 4, and so Quebec and Manitoba have said actually you can grow 0, and that's how many you can grow. Here in BC, the city of Surrey has a controlled substances bylaw, and what it does is it says it's administrative, not criminal. And so what it does, it says if you are going to grow cannabis in your home, either illicitly or for medical purposes, you are actually required to reach out to a environmental remediation consultant at the end of your grow before you sell your home. And so that means that everybody who chooses to use a house, like, and this is coming back on the landlords, obviously landlords and homeowners, not necessarily on renters, but if you allow this in your home and then you want to sell, you have to get a remediation consultant to come in and, you know, potentially do $50,000 of work on your house. And so they found, speaking to the fire chief of Surrey, they found that bylaw really deterred a lot of cannabis grow-ups and actually resulted in them moving out of the city. So there are things you can do. Whether or not the city approach is going to be possible after legalization, I don't know, because it won't be a controlled substance anymore. It'll be legal. But even for the medical usage, they were able to do that.
It's Anne-Marie. Can I add one thing to this?
Sure.
So yes, Manitoba and Quebec currently have said no home growing, although there is an issue called federal paramountcy, which allows individuals to challenge the province when their regulations stand in the face of a federal legislation, and the cases can be taken to the Supreme Court. And this has been seen in a number of different other health-related issues. So UBC professors are suggesting that where they're trying to ban home growing provincially, there may be challenges in the Supreme Court around whose law takes precedent over the others around the cannabis issue.
Yeah, good point. Are there any other questions on the line?
Scroll down.
Oh. Genius. Okay, so from John here, there's been a media report of potentially large oversupplies of products with number of commercial licenses. I don't know much about that. I haven't seen that report.
That's what happened in Washington State. There was a massive oversupply right in the very beginning.
One of the questions, concerns that I have is the environmental issues raised seem to be related to commercial legal production, not personal use production. How do you know that the issues shared are actually an issue for personal growing of a small number of plants? Okay, thank you, Leah. It is and it isn't. So as I mentioned, some of the problems here are scalable, and some are not actually related to the number of plants you grow at all. So things like inappropriate pesticide use, I haven't talked about a lot about that today because it's more part of the EH talk that I do, but there are a number of pesticides that can be used on cannabis, and then there's a whole bunch that shouldn't be. And the problem is that people often, they don't know where to go to find good information about pesticides, so they'll go to Home Depot and they'll buy whatever fungicide they can find. So one of those fungicides is a thing called Eagle 20. It is incredibly commonly used in cannabis in the US and in Canada. You can go to any kind of cannabis cultivation forum and find recipes for how to use it, usually way above the label instructions. Many people using this and providing advice to their peers about using it. And the reason why that's important, or the reason why they do it, is because they feel that it's safe, because the label use is for grapes and tomatoes and strawberries and stuff like that. So like, this is very benign, this is not going to hurt me. However, you really cannot be smoking and inhaling myclobutanil. It's not a good idea. It's considered a bad actor pesticide. It's a carcinogen, and it's really not appropriate to be used on something that's going to be smoked. So that problem is not a problem of the number of plants. That's a problem of somebody growing 4 plants. They stick to their limits. Maybe they only grow 2 plants, but they grow 4 or 5 cycles a year, and they do that for years on end. And they're using myclobutanil because, as I haven't mentioned, but cannabis can be a little bit tricky to grow because of mold. If you start to get mold infestations in cannabis, it's really difficult to get rid of, particularly this thing called powdery mildew, and Eagle 20 is amazing for that. So people will turn to this product again and again and again. Once the spore is inside their house, it's really difficult to not have future crops that are also contaminated, so they'll just keep going back and using the same product again and again. So that's a case where the plant limit doesn't matter. It's inappropriately using that pesticide again and again over time. Okay, so the legal ramifications of having more than 4 plants in your home. I have a table of penalties as they're like, they've actually, during the last reading of the Cannabis Act in the House of Commons, they actually, I think, made some modifications. So I don't have that table of penalties right in front of me, but the legal ramifications are kind of moot because law enforcement has come right out and said we cannot effectively police how many plants people have in their homes. There's 2 reasons for that. First of all, police used to be able to enter a property when they could smell marijuana. So they would go to the door, you could smell the cannabis, you could go inside and seize it because it was an illegal substance. And it didn't matter how many plants you have. But now, if you go to the door and you get a very strong cannabis odor, it doesn't mean you can go waltz into that house and check many plants. Also, that sounded enthusiastic. The other issue that police could potentially have is that they may have to maintain the plants that they see. So if you go into somebody's house and they've got 20 plants, and you take those, you then have to verify whether or not that person's a medical producer, or you have to hold the plants until there's a court proceeding or some sort of issue where the police would literally have to have a greenhouse to keep the plants alive. Okay, they can't kill the person's plants until it's determined that they are actually illicit plants. So it's absolutely crazy. Like the law enforcement challenges that are being conversed about are just really quite remarkable. So yeah.
The other challenges around renters
Can you speak up a little bit more?
Oh, the other challenge is around landlords and rental agreements. You spoke very briefly about rental situations where tenancy could be transient, or not, but it gets really messy when you've got, you know, mold as already an inherently difficult issue to tease out whose responsibility it is in remediating that, and then now you've got home growth potentially
And
by
I mean,
tenants.
theoretically, like, go ahead, Anne-Marie.
No, I also wanted to add that one of the interesting things just about the charges or things related to the cannabis home production, one of the things that keeps being trotted out is that it doesn't really matter. I mean, if you get charged, the penalties would be small, but the implications for travel are significant. So anybody who is charged with a marijuana-related issue will really be restricted in terms of their ability to go to the United States. So it's interesting that while it's not necessarily a big deal in Canada, the implications of it for you, your own personal autonomy, might be more of a compelling issue not to break a marijuana-related law than the actual in Canada implications.
Yeah, that's true. So, we're at 11 o'clock and I don't see any additional questions. So our,
Well, I'll get that one. But after that, we'll cut it off. And
so Anne-Marie and I's email address is on here. Please don't hesitate to reach out. We're here to help. And also we're here to collect information about what you think is important so that we can work on those things. So please do not hesitate to reach out. So here we have, I don't know what health unit that is. Nope, I don't know. Do you know if anyone is looking into potential risks for those who will be delivering ordered product? Canada Post. Risks to the posties. No, I don't. I feel like law enforcement people would have something to say about that. Like, if you're talking like about like a rip, like a, I have to quit using the cannabis terms, like a delivery people being robbed, then that might be something to talk to law enforcement about. Oh, Hastings, Prince. Okay, cool. So, great. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And as I said, if there's any more questions, please reach out. Thank you.